2 of In the Lead, we take some time to celebrate UCA's 70th anniversary by talking with a few of our past presidents. The field of educational leadership is still a relatively young field, and UCA's history has both shaped and been shaped by the developments in the broader field. To commemorate the 70 years of UCEA, we take some time to listen and learn about the pivotal moments in our history and the impact on the study and understanding of educational leadership. Today, we hear from Martha McCarthy, Presidential Professor Emeritus at Loyola Marymount University and Chancellor's Professor Emeritus at Indiana University. Martha's tremendous influence on UCEA and the field has been so deep that it is truly impossible to sum up, but we will give it a try. Throughout her impactful career, Martha has served in numerous educator roles, including elementary teacher, school administrator, professor, program director, and department chair. She also shattered UCEA's glass ceiling, becoming our first female president. Her scholarly contributions span a broad range of topics, including educational law and policy, equity issues, characteristics of student and faculty and administrative preparation programs. In so many ways, Martha's career has unfolded just as UCEA and the field itself have unfolded. What are Martha's insights about the development of educational leadership and preparation over the decades? How does she view UCA's place in this constantly evolving landscape? Listen to find out. Welcome to In the Lead, Martha, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation.
On a personal note, it's just so wonderful to see you and have you be a part of this bigger conversation that's really important, not just to the field, but to us as an organization. So we're just going to drop right in. And if you can tell us a little bit about your experiences and what some of the pivotal points in the field's development have been during your career.
Well, certainly a pivotal point was in the early days of the career of the field, and I wasn't involved at this time. But when NCPEA and UCEA were established in the mid 20th century, and there were some forward-thinking academics, not very many at that time, but there were a few that started these organizations and with a little bit different goals in mind. NCPEA in 47 was designed to better prepare aspiring practitioners. Then there was this influx of Kellogg Foundation funds to, I think, about 30 institutions by the mid 50s that were, this money was designed to study school administration. So it's a little bit different than the impetus for NCPEA. And that's when UCEA came about. And it was very elitist initially because these institutions were research one institutions and they were looking at the study. And the two organizations went somewhat on different paths for a while. And one looking more at the practitioners and the really the institutions that were preparing more practitioners, where the Research One institutions were studying about administration, trying to influence preparation that way. I think they've come back together much, much more in recent years. And I think our conventions, the UCEA conventions, have been very helpful in that regard. And just as an aside, I have to say, I remember really well my first NCPEA summer conference. They had a summer conference every year since it started. It was in the mid 70s. My co-presenter and I on the Women's Equity Project were the only female presenters at the meeting. And they kept trying to funnel us into activities for spouses.
So oh my goodness.
I didn't go back to the NCPEA.
And Martha was like, just wait a minute.
Yeah, for quite a while. And it certainly is a very different organization now, but in those days it was. And my first plenum for UCEA again in the mid 70s, and I was the only female in the room. And I wasn't even a PSR. I was substituting for Dave Clark, who was the IU PSR. And in those days, PSRs were usually your more senior faculty. That had shifted with UCEA over time. But I just had to mention as an aside, those early memories are quite vivid to me. So, yeah, another pivotal point, I
Mm,
think, was the National Commission on Excellence in Ed Administration from 1985 to 87. And this was modeled after the Commission on Teachers that produced A Nation at Risk. And
hmm
Dan Griffith was the chair of this commission. And Al Shanker, Bill Clinton were members. We had a couple of deans. There were several of us that were faculty members that were on it, but it produced Leaders for America's Schools. It really made a lot of recommendations for the field. And one of the most significant, I thought, was establishing the National Policy Board to bring
hmm
together representatives of principals, superintendents, school
Right.
boards, the two professional associations for professors to make policy recommendations. I don't know, Monica. I mean, it was very instrumental there for a while. I don't know whether the
Yep.
policy board is even still operating, but
Well,
it
I'm happy to tell you it is.
oh, it is. Okay. Well, that's
Right.
good. I hadn't heard that much recently, but it did a lot. It made a lot of decisions. I think it endorsed
Right.
ethics standards and some other
hmm
things that were again
Correct. Right. Right. Right.
pivotal points in the field. So I think the National Commission was certainly important. UCA's annual conventions. I mean,
Mm,
it's very important as far as the development of our field. Really, Monica, prior to the 80s, UCA's reach was not that broad. It
okay.
didn't impact those that weren't at UCEA programs, and even those programs, the PSR
Right.
was involved, but maybe some of the faculty didn't know much about what
Mm,
UCA was doing. And it's interesting now. No Gerardo has said the lore is that Jay Scribner and I were sitting in a room, and I said, "Hey, let's start UCA conferences." But I don't have any recollection of that particular conversation. But I do remember talking with Pat Forsyth in the executive committee and saying, let's think about how we can broaden the reach, and conferences would be one way we could do that. I know when we had the plenum the year I was president, we about doubled the size. We invited a bunch of people who weren't PSRs to come to the meeting to talk about some of the work of the National Commission. And then
mm,
we laid the groundwork for the Charlottesville conference, which
right.
was our first official convention. I think we had 150 people there. And I know Pat
Yay.
at the first few conferences would always tell the story about how he and I in the executive committee had these conversations, and he'd always blame me for all the additional work he had because of the conferences. But that stopped after a couple of years. Institutional memory is very short lived. I think
It is.
that most people involved in UCA now think
Yeah.
we've always had conferences, just like
Oh,
NCPEA has always had its summer
right.
meeting. I think they probably feel that way. And I have to say, Monica, although I'm very proud of having suggested them, I take absolutely no credit for their success. That goes to you, that goes to Michelle and Pat and
Mm-hmm.
all your planning teams. Clearly, there was a need. They have
Right.
grown to
Right.
what, 1,000 people coming to these
Yep.
conferences now. And they
Yep.
really have done what the original intent was, which was to broaden the involvement in these robust conversations beyond faculty at UCEA member institutions. And I really think it has brought together all those that are involved. So I take my hat off to all of you for the
Right.
success of the conferences. They've just been terrific.
Yeah, well, conventions are only as good as the participants, and so we've been really, even from the time when I started coming to convention, it's grown considerably, and I think, you know, and I don't know if that's a result of sort of the field becoming bigger, but the need for community has also grown. And as as higher ed continues its complexity, people feeling the need to come back to a place where they can just touch base with each other and and share work and create new knowledge and all the things that we hope happens at conventions. So, whether or not it was you, Martha, uh, who started the convention. I like that lore personally, but I understand it takes more than one person to come up with a great idea. So, but it's great, and I think if you look on our new website in some of our archives, we've actually included the program from that very first convention
Terrific.
in Virginia. So we're trying to recreate some of that history, because I think you're right. It's easy to forget. And sometimes it takes a lot of work to remember. So, hearing from you, hearing your stories, I just think is really, really important, not just in our 70th year, but just for the health of UCEA. Let me switch questions, or switch for a little bit. Um, and you've talked about sort of changes that have happened in the field, and the way that UCEA was sort of present at those moments. I think this question about the interrelationship between the development of the field and the development of UCEA is a really interesting one. And so I don't know if you have any thoughts to share about that.
Hmm. Well, I think UCEA has really been important at every stage of the development of the field itself. And if you look at the National Commission that I mentioned, UCA was very much involved in that. And Dan Griffith, was completely committed to UCA, and he was the chair of that group. But in subsequent things, the shift, and some of these shifts have been more gradual, but the shift to focusing on equity and social justice. UCA has played a pivotal role there. The Jackson Scholars. I know in the studies we did of the professoriate, and I'll be glad to talk more about them, we saw
Mm,
an increase in the minority representation. But my guess is, because that last study we did was in 2008, that it's much higher now.
right.
And I think this is due in part to the involvement of UCA and the Jackson Scholars. So I really see UCEA as a very important actor all along. And I have to
Mm,
say that the conferences have cemented UCEA's role at being at the helm of leadership preparation and reform, because that's the major place where these conversations take place. So I really do think that UCA has
yeah.
been important
Yeah.
all along.
Right. Yes. I mean, it's nice to think about that, and sort of that reciprocity, right, between how the field has grown and how UCA has grown. I think is a really powerful, um, just image to me.
Yes.
But thanks for mentioning those studies in the professoriate. So, I mean, please tell us a little bit more about what those were, and what are some of the things that you took away from that.
Yes. I've been involved in three of the studies, and our first one in the mid 80s, and actually I took that on when I was president of UCEA. And UCEA has been the sponsor of all of the studies. Um,
Mm,
but the first one was done in 72 by Campbell and Newell. And then we replicated
mm,
in the mid 80s, mid 90s, and then 2008. So we have almost 40 years of longitudinal data on faculty
right.
in our field and units in our field. And there are some things that have been very different and some things that have been very much the same over time. But one of the major differences, Monica, are female representation. And there was 2% of the faculty. Literally, I was to say we could meet in a phone booth when I entered the field, and that was true. We had four female faculty members, so we truly could meet in the phone booth. But 2% of the faculty were women in 72. And then by '08, almost at parity. And my guess is now probably more of the faculty are women than men. So
Right.
that was huge. And in some of the studies, uh, women were more oriented towards social justice and equity issues. That by the '08 study, the differences in attitudes was not nearly as significant as it had been in the earlier studies. Does that mean women changed the norms in the
Right.
units themselves? Quite possibly, but those
Yep.
things are different. But there were just I could go on and on about those studies because there's so many things that are different. The number of units increased dramatically by 2008, almost 600, and the size of the faculty had declined in each unit. And generalists were much, much more likely to be hired than content specialists, law, finance, politics, and so on. And it seemed like the content specialists
Right.
hit its peak
Huh.
probably in the 90s. We had, when PEA and the Law Association, the Finance Association, all these separate associations
Right.
were formed in the 80s and some earlier than that. But they really hit their peak, it seemed, in the 90s. And maybe they're hiring generalists because they have fewer faculty in the ed
Right.
leadership units now. But there were just a lot of things that we saw that changed over time. I was surprised between the 90s and the '08 study that number of articles, research productivity seemed to decline. It had steadily increased until the 90s, and then it seemed to decline.
Hmm.
Again, maybe it's because we have more units. One thing you might think, we have more clinical
Right.
faculty, that would be why, but really, even on the tenure track faculty, it had declined somewhat. So that it's not just because we had
Right.
more clinical. But I'd really like to put in a plea for another study of that
Yep.
because it's so important, Monica, for us to know who we are, what our characteristics are,
Right.
our attitudes, our activities, and how these have changed or maybe not changed over time. So I'll just put in
Right.
a quote that I'd like to see that happen.
No. No, I'll accept that plea, and maybe we can convince you to come out of retirement to help us with that.
I might help. So this is something that's really important to me, and so
Right.
it's not inconceivable that can happen.
Right. That would be fabulous. Um, I think you also have a really interesting perspective on, as you've talked about several times, about the role of women, in the field and within UCEA. And so, as we were sort of getting ready for our conversation, we found that since you became the first female president, um, there have been more women presidents than men presidents. And so I was just curious as to your reaction to that, and
Yeah,
what you were
it's just
thinking about that.
it's amazing. I think it's great, but it seemed like right about the time when I was elected president of UCEA, we were seeing a change in the field, and we were seeing more
Mm,
female students and more faculty. The first 15, 20 years I was at IU, I was the only female in our unit. By the time I left, we had more women than we did men. And that seemed to happen, and it seemed to happen really quickly. What you were saying about more female presidents
interesting.
after me than before.
Right.
And I have to say, um, Jack Culbertson was ahead of his time. My first involvement with UCEA was that Women's Equity Project that he got funding
Mm,
from the Women's Educational Equity Act to launch this project with 5 institutions, male female team. And Monica, he couldn't find 5 tenure track females. Can you imagine? This is mid 70s.
wow.
So
No.
two of our teams had clinical females because it was a male female team at each institution. And Dave Clark was my co-director. And I'll never forget, I met him,
Wow.
but I didn't know him well. He had just stepped down as the dean, and I was a brand new assistant professor. And he said to me, he said, I'm not very interested in women's equity, but I'm committed to UCEA, so I'll be your co-director. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got this co-director that doesn't care about our topic. Well, it was it didn't take long for me to learn that Dave Clark is never involved in anything in name only. He became so
Mm,
involved in that project, such a champion of women's equity. If anyone in our department meetings said something sexist, he would rise up, and he was 6'4". He'd rise up and take them to task in no uncertain terms, and I didn't have to say anything. It was great to have him there as a champion. He got so involved that the materials we developed to advance equity for women, he and I taught a course gratis, no compensation at all, in the summer to try out our materials. So he really did become a
Wow.
champion. But the thing that was so important to me
Mm.
personally was developing this network at 5 institutions of people that I knew. So at conferences and things, I knew some people. And
Right.
it was just such a wonderful, and it just developed my commitment to UCEA right from the beginning, because that project was so important to me. And I would love to see UCEA involved in some other interinstitutional projects. We went to each, by the way, we went to each of the 5 institutions and tried out our materials. So we had focus groups at each of the
Mm.
institutions, and each of us had a different target group. And it was a wonderful project. And I have to say, Jack Culbertson was ahead of his time because that was
Right.
probably not the most popular topic then.
Mm. Right. And also in developing a model on how to do that, inter university collaboration and knowledge building, which
Yes,
then ripples in the field. So
it was just
yeah,
wonderful.
you talked about your personal growth, and I was wondering if we could sort of wrap up with a reflection on how UCEA has shaped you as a professional, as a person, in the time that you've been involved.
Wow. Well, definitely my involvement in the equity project that I just mentioned shaped me to a great extent. Being president was something that had a terrific impact on me. You probably don't know the story of this, but the person that was slated to be president before me had passed away. And we had decided in the
Mm.
executive committee that we were all going to vote for our Richard Rossmiller to do a second term since the person had passed away,
Okay.
which is the way I cast my vote, by the way. And when they came back and said it's a historic moment, we had the first female, the blood drained from my face. I can tell you, I had to end the meeting. I mean, I had to take over immediately. I had to end the meeting, which I'm sure I did
Oh my
very poorly.
gosh.
So that experience was was quite formative for me. But working with Pat, working with Michelle, working with you as executive directors, it's just been wonderful to be part of the
Mm.
UCEA family. And I don't think any
Mm.
organization has had more of an impact on me. And I've talked to you several times that we need to, reach out to the people that are so committed and be sure that they're including in their wills UCEA, as I am, because I think that
Right.
we could get a lot of people that feel like UCA was so instrumental in their careers
Mm.
at various junctures, for sure. So, yeah, I'm committed
Mm.
and always will be. So you can count on me, Monica.
I'm sort of just like laughing here, Martha, because I can't imagine you doing anything poorly.
Well,
You are an all-in kind of human being.
you're kind to say that. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks so much, Martha, again for sort of sharing these stories. And I think you're right in helping us remember the history of the organization, because some of us, some of the younger scholars, just this is just what it has been, as opposed to thinking about it's something that's grown over time, and then also thinking about where we have left to grow. And so I appreciate you taking time from your busy life, and look forward to seeing you hopefully very soon.
Yes,
We'll be in LA for convention, so hopefully we'll get to see
well,
you
and
there.
I'll see you at AERA. So I'll be
Oh,
there.
perfect. Then I'll
Yeah,
see you in a couple of days.
see you in a few days for
Thanks
sure.
again, Martha. It's been
All right.
fabulous talking with you.
It was great. Thanks.